So, welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast for all things yoga and beyond. I'm Adam Keen, your host, and I hope to facilitate in-depth and unique discussions with teachers, scholars, wellness experts, meditators, and chefs, to name but a few. We've carried this podcast on a weekly basis since the first lockdown of 2021. We don't make any cash out of this, so any donations at keenonyoga.com are appreciated. Today's guest is Stephen Cope, best-selling teacher, author, scholar in residence at Kripalu Yoga and Wellness Center. Kripalu Yoga and Wellness Center, the largest center for the study and practice of yoga in the Western world, in Massachusetts. Kripalu hosts almost 50,000 guests a year in its 200-acre grounds, and Massachusetts is in the US, of course. As a psychotherapist, until a sea change in his late 30s, Stephen Cope specializes in the relationship between the Eastern contemplative traditions and the Western psychological ones. He is the author of many fantastic books, among which Yoga and the Quest for Our True Self was a real inspiration for me, actually, in the early years of my yoga journey. The great work of your life, however, is the main topic of our discussion today. Stephen's most recently published book, making the philosophy of the Bhagavad-Gita relevant to all of us struggling to find our purpose in life, our meaning in life. A fantastic, practical and thoughtful conversation was had together today about the meaning of Dharma in the modern world and how we might go about finding and even recognizing our meaning in life. Yoga Journal named Stephen one of the most influential thinkers, writers and teachers on the current American yoga scene, and this is certainly true in my mind today. An episode not to be missed. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't hesitate to let us know, and equally, please leave us a review on iTunes. Welcome, Stephen, to the Keen on Yoga podcast. So welcome, Stephen, to the Keen on Yoga podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
So glad to do it, Adam. Very glad.
Yeah, I never really know how people are going to retort to that question. And some people just leave it silent. So it's always, always going to waiting to see how people...
I'm actually glad to be here.
Yeah, it's been really, really nice already to have a chat with you beforehand. And so Stephen, you've been a resident yoga teacher at the Kripalu Center in was it upstate New York? Is that correct?
It's actually in Massachusetts.
Okay. Yeah. We don't have, as Brits, great geographical knowledge of the states. So it's not bad. At least I thought you were on the West Coast for a while, so we're getting closer. And you've been a resident teacher in Kripalu for many years, I believe.
Yeah, for 32 years now.
Oh wow! Right.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay. So you've seen it evolve a lot, and I suppose let's go back to how you got there, and let's go back to the start. Why did you get involved in yoga in the first place? What led you to yoga, and how did that involve to the Kripalu Center? Before we go on to our discussion today.
Sure. Well, when I was in graduate school in Boston, I got very involved in Buddhism. So I actually came into Buddhism through Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the great crazy wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Who escaped that as a monk and came.
He was teaching you directly.
Well, he was the teacher of the Sangha I was in. I rarely saw him, right. But he was the guy in the
legendary figure. Yeah.
Legendary, and this is quite a long time ago, of course. Of course, he'd escaped Tibet as a monk, and then he came to Oxford. He wrote some brilliant books about Buddhism. Really, the first books that became highly mainstream in America about Buddhism and translated it for the kind of average person. I was completely lit up by the Dharma. I was in graduate school. I ran into meditation. I started sitting intensively. And it's almost like an argument for me for past lives. Like I seemed to recognize the Dharma when I first heard it. I recognized its brilliance, and something caught me profoundly. So I became a very impassioned meditator in my 20s. And then
so constantly we hear this fact that people almost feel like they just somehow came into something with no understanding of where it came from, and then the last person I can't even remember the last podcast I did. I do so many, but I mean, I remember the hearing of the very last person, that same feeling that just, they'd always felt that they were attracted to meditate. It just came so naturally. And I have to tell you, before I go with your story, the Chogyam Trungpa and Akon Rinpoche. Now, Akon Rinpoche, they formed Sami Ling in Scotland. Now they were. I think they escaped together, and they were kind of companions over the mountains. And then they went on to form a place near me in Essex called Marper House, and that's a famous. Well, Essex is not the place you put Buddhism, right? And my upbringing wasn't necessarily particularly Buddhist, to put it lightly, but that happened to be 15 minutes away on the bike as a kid. So that was my introduction of facts. And I have to say, it's because you brought it up, is that to cycle up there. No one else was going there. No kids were there. But as a 16-year-old, I would leave my friends, pub or whatever, then cycle up there and stay for weekends and stuff. And I was just attracted to it. So sorry, I just wanted
there you go. That's exactly
a bizarre kind of coming home that just had no reason to be there in Essex.
Well, it's almost a sense of of recognition. Like for me, there was something I recognized in the genius of the Buddhist view. Its rationality, almost its empiricism. It was so practical, and it was so beautiful. It was like I recognized it. So I started meditating, and I think because I'm a classical pianist, I already had a very concentrated mind. So I got the concentration aspect of meditation right away, and I was in with both feet. And then in my 30s, a buddy of mine introduced me to yoga, and he said, "Look, in the classical scriptures, yoga is considered a preparation for meditation, right? So it calms the body and mind, it prepares you to sit." In the 8 limbs of yoga, asana, really means posture and sitting posture for meditation. So I thought, well, anything that improves my meditation. So I dove into yoga, and then I absolutely adored yoga from the
first. Right. And I suppose I just assumed you'd always been a professional yoga teacher, but what was your background? What were you doing for work then? Was it music? I knew that from your books that you were, but I didn't realize that you were.
No, I'm a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist. Yeah. And so until I was 40, I had a psychoanalytic psychotherapy practice in Boston. I went to Boston, to Amherst College and Boston College and BU, and I studied in one of the analytic institutes, and so I had a deep psychotherapy practice.
Right.
And I was fascinated by the relationship between the Eastern contemplative tradition's view of the self and the Western psychological tradition. So I got very interested in that. And about that time, Mark Epstein was writing his brain. Thoughts Without a Thinker was a pivotal book for me. And so I became very fascinated with the relationship between the Eastern contemplative traditions and Western psychology. In my late 30s, I ended a 15-year relationship, which was a really rough time for me. And I decided to take a year sabbatical from my psychotherapy practice in Boston. And Kripalu was the closest kind of well-established monastic setting that I could go into. And back in those days, this was 32 years ago, we had a real ashram situation there. So we had all of the components of the ashram, the chanting and the prayer and the selfless service. And there were 350 of us living then at Kripalu as karma yogis, offering our time.
350, that's huge.
350.
Yeah.
We
that's bought, it's a reasonable sized monastery. Yeah.
We bought a huge Jesuit novitiate. So the biggest Jesuit novitiate in America was built in the 50s, and they expected an influx of baby Jesuits. And then in the 60s, nobody wanted to be Jesuits anymore. So we bought this monastery, essentially, and we filled it up with aspiring yogis. And for until about 1994, so that would have been, well, for me, that was only 6 or 7 years.
So were you a founder, or were you a kind of co-founder?
I wasn't. I was kind of a founder, one of the people who founded the second iteration of Kripalu. So Kripalu had the inevitable guru scandal. So we had
really? I didn't know that. Right.
Yeah, we had a very famous guru from India.
Okay.
Who founded us in Pennsylvania, and then we bought this monastery. And then it was discovered that he was, of course, playing around with disciples. He was being inappropriate in a number of ways.
Yes.
So we asked him to resign. He left. And at that point, we reinvented ourselves into a 501c3 educational organization. That was in 1994 and 95. And I stayed on at that point, and I became kind of a pillar of the place going forward, which was great for me because I got to help develop all of our programming and our yoga programming and philosophy programming. And so then I started writing books, and I'm just finishing my 6th book.
I know. And I think, was it your first book, The Quest for the True Self, with yoga? That was fantastic. I mean, that's how I first, and I'm thinking this must have been early on in my own yoga journey, maybe 20 years back almost. And I think that book, and I was going to go back and read that as well, but I ended up just more reading your new book, and I don't have so much time. But I remember it was quite psychological in its kind of attempt to weave two things together, right? To look at yoga from a lens that was a little bit more Western in terms of,
Right. That's what I was doing back in those days.
Yeah, I loved it. Yeah.
Merging the two things. So anyway, I'm now scholar emeritus at Kripalu, and I've just had a fabulous career and time there. Doing yoga, practicing meditation, teaching, writing, exploring, and now I would say my dharma is diving deeply into the great treatises of yoga and translating those for the mainstream practitioner. Quite frankly, yoga, the yoga traditions, at least in America, are pretty non-intellectual, right? So you don't have a lot of people here in the States reading the Gita in Sanskrit. And so it requires translation into, well, what does this mean for me? What does it mean for my life? How can I use it?
Yeah.
We're very practical minded over here. And so the book that you and I will probably talk about, The Great Work of Your Life, was an attempt to bring the genius of the Bhagavad-Gita back into the mainstream so people could use it. I think that's just very relevant because I'm kind of aware of a lot of scholarly work around, and looking at the texts and the where they come from and the interpolations, etc. But how does that generally kind of grab the individual who just wants to know, how they can appease their own suffering or find their own purpose, And I think it's a very necessary place for your recent book is fantastic. And I suppose, I was going to ask you more about your yoga. I mean, do you want to say anything more about your thoughts about yoga and meditation? It seems that you're more invested in the meditation, and the yoga is a kind of vehicle in the kind of Patanjalian way for stability within the meditation. Would that be? So my introduction to yoga, you'll find this strange, was actually through Bikram. So I spent the winters in Key West. And
it's kind of strange, yeah.
Bikram's first teacher, the one that he had authorized, was in Key West, Rani. And so for years, I was in deep Bikram training. Now we're talking about the 1980s, like the mid 80s, or even the earlier 80s. And then when I came to Kripalu, I discovered a much more mindful kind of practice. So Kripalu's very mindful practice really syncs up with my interest in meditation.
Yeah.
More than, of course, Bikram does. But I love the more physical, kick-ass yoga as well. I do. I do.
Yes. Well, it doesn't seem to go, I wouldn't say Bikram is necessarily like a mindful kind of yoga, is it? So probably you wouldn't put Bikram and the Bhagavad-Gita immediately together.
No, you would not.
No.
Right.
Okay, let's make a start. And the great work of your life, which is the book we particularly want to talk about, is a book on finding your Dharma, right? And looking at the Bhagavad-Gita, which is a story about someone who's struggling with their Dharma and in a quandary. And it's a medieval book. It's a very old book. And what Stephen has done is really bring this to light with some relevant and current examples of his own life. So I suppose I might surprise you, first of all, Stephen, to asking you a little bit more about your finding of your Dharma, because I was interested. And what often grabs me about people's books, and people always tell me to write more specifically and personally about myself as well, and I always resist. But what grabs me about other people's books often is that very fact, is your brother having this penchant for racing, for making racing cars, right? And you always carrying the big piano every place you moved. You had to carry this piano around with you because you were a classical musician. I mean, do you want to talk about the finding your Dharma in life? Because it does seem like you've had such a strong calling for this. You've been involved in the center, which is no easy. I mean, I've been involved in these kind of centers, and they're no easy undertaking. One thinks that you're made there, but it's living in a community with many bosses, or many. It's not an easy thing whatsoever. So you've picked a very specific Dharma there. And and it's, I suppose you could say it's been quite strong, really. I mean, up to a certain age, you were in the psychoanalytic field, but you really have carved one line in the sand for many years, really, after starting from a very different place.
Yeah. It's very counterintuitive for me because I was brought up in a very high WASP family, right? A very patrician American family, if you will. And we had very clear ideas about who we should be in the world, the kinds of jobs we should have,
right,
how we should look. And it just so happened that I didn't fit into any of those categories. First of all, I was gay. That really did not fit. I was interested in music and the arts. That also didn't fit, even though I was a pretty good pianist. I never got any support from my family. I tell the story of Jane Goodall in this book. And Jane Goodall is an example of someone whose Dharma, whose calling was seen by her parents, her mother particularly, at a very young age. And so you get to see the story of someone whose Dharma was appreciated, mirrored back, supported. And of course, we can watch as Jane Goodall goes from the young girl watching the hen drop the egg, all the way working with Louis Leakey and so forth.
Yeah, and Jane Goodall was the lady who did the. Was it orangutan? What was it?
No, it was chimpanzees.
Gorillas. Was it gorillas and chimpanzees? Yeah. And did she end up getting killed by one of them in the end? Was that true?
That's the gorilla. That's Gorillas in the Mist. That's the other great scientist whose name I'm blocking on.
Right. Okay, I've confused the two, but Jane Goodall was English, wasn't she? And
yes,
we know, but just to confirm to our audience who she was. And yes, it's an unusual experience to have our Dharma mirrored back to us. And I just think, going back to a few podcasts ago, and you might be interested in a guy, David Roche, who also grew up in the North Carolina or South Carolina, I get confused, a gay in the 1950s, was interested in movement and dance. His family, or his stepfather made him join a military school. At which point the favorite thing in the school, he liked the marching. He liked the marching band and the twirling and the dancing, the theatrics of that, but that didn't really cut it. So, it was a hilarious podcast and very well listened for someone whose Dharma was completely out of kilter with the time and place he found himself in, like you. And similarly for me, I was from Essex. It's more of a working class area, I suppose, very unspiritual in any aspect. And suddenly we have this Buddhist center up the road bizarrely 15 minutes away. And, and no one, I can't even remember how I found out about it, but there's no one, young person going there. And I just got into it. So it's weird, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, we know somehow deep in our souls what we're, if I can use that word, what's calling to us. So, for example, when I was an undergraduate, I went to I went to Amherst College, which is a very elite all-male school in Massachusetts. And there's a sister school, Smith College, which had a big ballet program. And I was really into ballet. And I started learning it and practicing it. I was very good at it. And so my very first career was in dance, which mortified my family. I was supposed to be an international lawyer and make lots of money. And I'm dancing in Minneapolis. It was just so freaky for my family. Yeah. So I really had to stick to my guns early on. And so
latterly, did they support you?
Marginally, with kind of bated breath. They were sure that I would eventually find the right path, but of course I never did. I've always been way more on the margins than kind of the rest of my family. But to me, that's been great because it's allowed me a lot of freedom of choice. And it allowed me to take a year off from my practice, my psychotherapy practice in Boston, and move to this ashram and try it out. Because at that point, I had been doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy for 10 years. I was tired of it. I was burned out. I was tired of listening to people's, neurotic problems. And I could barely stand to go to the office. And I knew that there was something else calling me. I was only 38, 39 then. So I dove into my meditation practice to try to listen to what's calling me. And I just kept getting this voice that said, take a year off, go and practice your meditation, go and practice your yoga. And so I took that year off. And of course, I never came back. I ended up becoming very involved in the development of Kripalu, and it's several iterations now. But there is a point where, as you well know, Adam, where you have to take a leap. You have to take a risk. And there are no guarantees when you jump off the cliff from your practice inside your well-established practice, the whole bit. You take a leap and you dive into an ashram for a year at 40. It's risky. It might not have worked. It did work, however. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy also to kind of tell Dharma from the story of the times it works out,
Yes, that's
right.
It
might, it might not have worked out. And also I think the big thing is people think, I'm probably listening, well, that's great, but maybe, if I just stick and weather it out, maybe if you'd stuck it and weathered it out, you'd come into a new incarnation, I mean, you never know when to kind of, whether you should stick it out or whether you should just change,
Yeah, that's what I call the discernment phase of Dharma.
Right.
So in the Bhagavad-Gita, in the book that I've written, I've kind of simmered down the very complex teachings to four pillars. So there's the discernment phase. In other words, find out what your Dharma is. Find out precisely what's calling you. That's what I call the first pillar.
And also you were very specific in that, which is the thing that struck me, it really has to be specific. Like even if you're 5% out, that's not it. Which struck me as kind of interesting. And I also find that even within the yoga teaching, right? Like I've been teaching for many years, but I've definitely gone off kilter within the teaching in terms of a place of, a way, a relationship with a group. And that hasn't been it. And then I've been kind of 2% difference, maybe, like even for example, in the last time of the lockdown.
Yeah.
And suddenly I felt completely in line with it again in a way that I didn't before, but I was still teaching yoga. So, I mean, I liked the fact that you qualify. It has to be quite specific. It's not just, it's a yoga teacher and not a psychotherapist. It's actually, make it as specific as you can, because it makes a huge difference, the small print.
I'm so glad you raised that. I say in the book, aim is everything when it comes to the discernment phase. I tell the story of a priest who knew he was called to the church, was unhappy. And he finally realized that what had really called him to the church was music. And he played the organ, and he realized he was, if you'll pardon the overlapping meanings here, he was in the right church, but not the right pew, right? So he realized aim is everything. No, just realizing you want to be in the Catholic Church wasn't enough. He wanted to be a musician in the church music. And as soon as he made that shift, I knew this guy, his life just came alive, right? So for the most part, people's struggle with discernment does not require some huge life change. It almost always requires some kind of better aim, some kind of more specific aim. So there's a misapprehension about Dharma that it's romantic, and in order to find your Dharma, you have to leave your job selling insurance and move to Paris and paint, right? But more likely than not, you've already mucked around somewhere within the field of your Dharma. So what we're talking about now is really aiming it, and precision there is everything.
Yeah, because I think it's easy to kind of get, when you hear a message like this, and one is inevitably unsatisfied with elements of one's life, and you just think, oh, well, I'll just leave everything and become a painter then in Provence. You know what I mean? And I think that's the easy message to get out of it. Is like, well, we need these massive changes because we're always thinking like that. If it's not a 30-day challenge to something, then, it doesn't grab our attention, right? Yeah. But actually what you're talking about in qualification is that you probably aimed your life in this, to a certain degree, that there's other because also, remember, in the Bhagavad-Gita, we're not talking about one individual, are we? Arjuna is part of a collective. And so his life is, his life is contextualized by the meaning of many people around him, and it's so his meaning only lies in, a small adjustment really in terms of his relationship to what he's already doing. Right.
There you go. Here's another example. I recently met with a group of hedge fund directors down in New York, and there was a certain amount of, I'm really dissatisfied with this career. And when we nailed it down, what they were really dissatisfied was the lack of conscience in their field, especially after the 2008 meltdown, when their ilk were partly responsible for the whole thing melting down. So this group decided to form a group to talk about Dharma, and to talk not about leaving their chosen career, but how to refine it, how to reform it, so that they were actually doing good in the world at the same time as they were finding their own personal fulfillment. They were working toward the common good, and this is an aspect of the Gita that I think most people overlook, since we're so focused on personal fulfillment in this culture. But according to Krishna, personal fulfillment and the common good arise together. That is to say, when you really find your Dharma, even in the book, I give the example of, say your Dharma is stamp collecting, okay, which seems to have no relationship to the common good. When you find it, if that's truly your calling, guaranteed it will bring you in the direction of the universal problems that we're dealing with. Maybe you'll start getting interested in stamps that evoke the well-being of nature, the natural world, or endangered animals or something. You see what I'm saying? So
and I don't think I think as humans we don't make meaning in a vacuum. We need others around, or to use the lines of someone like Stephen Porges, the polyvagal theorist, co-regulation is a biological factor, isn't it? It's the major biological factor that as beings we need to co-regulate. You're meaningless if you're just doing something, in a bubble. You have to have some people around you to kind of, contextualize your own sense of self, I suppose. I realize I've interrupted you go through your 4 stages of the Bhagavad-Gita, if you would, for us, because I think that's very important, because I think oftentimes people see it, they come back to me after I've offered them the book and they go, I've read the whole thing. And then, well, okay. Well, it's like how to get into the book, and I think and trying to pinpoint 4 aspects of it I found it very useful in your book. So please.
Yeah, it's useful. I think so. There are 4 pillars of the Gita that we can agree on. Number 1 is discernment. Now, keep in mind that when the book was written, probably about 300 BCE, there was no discernment. You were born into your Dharma. Arjuna was born a warrior. He had no choice. However, that's characteristic of a traditional culture where there's not so much a sense of a personal self, but it's a socially embedded self. We have this much bigger sense of a personal self and subjectivity and personal fulfillment and satisfaction. So our discernment phase is the biggest part of the wrestling match of Dharma for most people. Like, how do I discern? So that's number 1, discernment. Number 2 is, once you've discerned your Dharma, once you know what's really calling you, do it full out. This is called the doctrine of unified action. Bring everything you've got to your Dharma. I tell the story of Susan B. Anthony, who was a great American women's rights activist. And the way, if you look at her beautiful life of Dharma, you see that she slowly focused until she was at the very knife edge of her calling, which was, she decided, was all about women's suffrage. And so her life kind of became a guided missile of women's suffrage. So focus, concentration, unified action, bring everything you've got to it. Don't leave anything on the table. So discernment, unified action. The 3rd pillar is the most difficult one to grasp, which is let go of the outcome, right? Krishna says to Arjuna, it's better to fail at your own Dharma than to succeed at the Dharma of another. So bring everything you've got and then let go of the fruits. Why? Because clinging and grasping to outcome actually takes you out of the moment. It takes you out of your capacity to actually fulfill the task or the skill that you're developing. So let go of the outcome is something that a lot of people struggle with, but once you get it, you realize that it's profoundly freeing. Find your Dharma, do it full out, let go, and then finally turn it over to God, or we might say turn it over to something bigger than yourself. If you don't God, turn it over to something bigger, because if you become the object of your own life, your own Dharma, your own seeking, it's too small. It's not big enough. You already talked about co-regulation. It's got to be bigger than just you. Freud said if you don't have big meaning and purpose in your life, you end up becoming your own baby, and you end up infantilizing yourself and not growing and not pushing. So find your Dharma, do it full out, let go of the fruits, and turn it over to something big.
I wanted you to elaborate on them, because I think it's good to have a way in to read the text. And obviously everyone has to grapple with the text themselves, because, it's a personal journey with it, right? And we kind of, the journey of reading the text and kind of trying to understand it and follow Arjuna in the whole process is one's own soul search, really. No one can tell you your own Dharma, can you? No one can create their own meaning. This is what you ought to be doing. It is a struggle, and I think it's a struggle for everyone, especially nowadays. I mean, it seems, I suppose, reading the Gita, the one thing that often kind of makes me laugh is when Krishna just says, well, do your duty. Duty, that's obvious. Just you're a warrior, just do your duty. And it's like, well, that's $1 million question nowadays, isn't it? It's like, well, what is duty? And you mentioned the idea of the individual as now, we're much more autonomous than we were then. And so Dharma is seen in much more individualistic terms. But then again, you have this paradox of giving it up to something greater, or the idea that it's not really us even doing it. I remember in the book, Susan B. Anthony, in the end, goes into the auditorium and they start clapping, right? And she says, "What are they clapping for?" And the person says, "Well, for you." And she says, "That's not for me. They're clapping for the work. Some yeah." But I mean, I think there's still a huge struggle here, which I don't know whether you could say any more on, between this sense that, we want certain aims and we want them in a very personal way, and to do something without any aim at all, just for the sake, Krishna says, act without wish for the fruits of the action. It's like, well, doesn't make sense. I mean, how do you, you're teaching big courses in Kripalu for the American public, which is maybe not necessarily schooled in yoga. I mean, just doing regular jobs and coming there for, a bit of yoga, they're not, how do you make sense of this kind of language to them?
You really have to dig, because first of all, Adam, the whole notion of duty is not particularly big in our culture right now. So duty almost, so there are different kinds of duty. Cicero wrote the great essay on duty. And there are duties that are imposed on us from without by our culture or our family. But the duties that we're talking about in Dharma are duties that you feel called on from within. Okay, so my definition of a duty in that regard is, what is it that if you don't do it in this lifetime, you will feel a profound sense of self-betrayal, right? So self-betrayal, there are all kinds of duties that people try to foist on me, right? But there are certain duties that are called for from within. I like to say there are two facets to finding your Dharma. One is you look at what's lighting you up, right? What's lighting you up in your life? That's an easy one. That's Campbell saying, "Follow your bliss." But the other one is duty, and duty is very different. Duty are things that are not necessarily fun, and two are combined. So there's some aspect of your Dharma that lights you up, and there are other aspects that are actually duty. So, for example, I've chosen a life of relationship to this big community, a large organization, and it's been fabulous. But there are some aspects of the work that are duty that I don't love, that I'm not even that good at, but that I have to do because it's part of the package. And I wouldn't not do them. For example, Kripalu, we have a $50 million a year budget. I'm the most visible Kripalu spokesperson. I do a lot of fundraising, which means I end up in rooms with hedge fund guys. And it's not always my favorite thing to do. And
no, I can imagine that.
I don't like asking for money, but it's a duty and it's called for and it's part of the package. And I do it. And over the long haul, there's some weird sense of beauty about it. It's somewhat sacrificial, right?
Yeah, and I mean that's a huge part of the book as well. That's and yoga, and everyone knows tapas, right? There's some sense doing stuff that's hard. Yeah. Just to follow your bliss attitude, which is a kind of baby boomer, look what mess that's got us into, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, you have to have both sides of this equation. And the whole idea of a Dharma all Dharmas are partly self-sacrificial, right? I tell the story of Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman, of course, had just achieved international fame with his book, Leaves of Grass, and Emerson had declared him a genius, and he was riding at the top of the world. This was in the 1850s. And then along comes the Civil War and blows up the whole culture. And his brother George is wounded, so he goes down to a hospital, and he discovers a new Dharma, which is, here he is, it's the height of his career. He decides, no, my Dharma now is to minister, to be a missionary to these suffering soldiers. So my Dharma now is to take all my poetic skills and write letters to their families for them and read poetry to them. And he is, to some extent, immolated by his years in the hospitals of the Civil War, which were difficult, nasty places. And yet out of that, what emerges out of that in his later career is this beautiful poetry about the Civil War. He became the bard of America's bard of the Civil War. So when Lincoln is assassinated, he writes the great poem, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." It's a mystery how that sacrifice actually bears fruit. And we're not a people or a culture that has much to do with self-sacrifice at all. It's a mystery. It's a part of Dharma. And I love the Whitman story because he brought everything he had to that Dharma of soldier's missionary. And it was beautiful. If you read what he wrote about his work in the hospitals and the poetry that he wrote later, it's a book called Drum Taps. It's just sublime. And here he was using his poetic genius to grapple with the massive death and destruction of the Civil War. And it's a great story to bring to the Bhagavad-Gita, because the Gita is about a war too. Oh, yeah. What about the carnage of war? Is there a just war? Is there such a thing? So these are all things that you have to look at if you're reading the Gita.
What about one of your most personal challenges with your own Dharma? Just a practical note again.
I think, honestly, it's been this question of duty. So I love to write. I come from a family of writers. My grandfather was a writer. He wrote mystery stories. He wrote novels. My mother was a poet. She produced books of poetry. I come to writing quite naturally, and I love it.
It's true. There's a lot of the stories in the book now. Thinking about it, a lot of them are about writers, aren't they?
You've got it's right.
You've got Frost, I think, haven't you, and Thoreau and Whitman. Yeah. And it's fascinating as someone who loves literature as well to see their own trajectories. Yeah.
So
sorry. Yeah.
So I love my writing world. Here I am in my study, right? My books, my writing, love it. But there's this other side of my Dharma, which is teaching. So you probably know in the Buddhist tradition, there's a strong call, once you've received the Dharma and heard it and understood it, to teach it. And I'm very much an introvert. I've never loved standing up in front of groups of 150 people and teaching and laying myself bare to that. It's been a real sacrificial calling my whole career. And yet I've done it. I've done it quite a lot. I think I do it well. It's one of those duties. So Mary Oliver has a great poem, A Dream of Trees. Do you know her poem called A Dream?
No, I don't.
It starts out something like this. I had a dream of trees, a dream of a wild, quiet life in the country. And the poem goes on to say that, but where life is actually happening for her and for the poet is where the people are and where the cities are. And so the poem ends, whoever made music of a mild day. So the music that she makes in her poetry calls her to the city, to the greatest conflicts of the time, to the difficulties. So I very much identify with that poem. That's been my conflict too. And usually if you have a Dharma, there's some, conflict in there about the parts of it that you love. You have to do.
Does everyone have a Dharma?
Yeah. I mean, this is where...
Some people will say, I don't have any Dharma in particular. I just do a job and, I get money and, that's that. You know what I mean? Like, buys food,
It's funny. I've published now 6 books, and I never read the reviews online because people just dump all kinds
good
of
idea.
But I accidentally read the latest review of my book, which is called The Wisdom of Yoga, which is my book on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And it's a very good book. And I only saw the headline of the review. It said, this book is elitist schlock, right? This book is elitist schlock. And
I don't even know what that word means. Must be some Americanism.
Yeah, it's an Americanism for bullshit. Basically.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah, I got the idea. Right. Yeah. Oh, what a shame. Well,
and the idea is elitism is now squarely on the outs. So the idea that, to get back to your point, that everybody has a dharma is seen as an elitist view.
Right.
Because, yeah, maybe you have time to have a dharma.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
The truth is, there's some truth to that. You know, I do believe that everyone does have a dharma.
Yeah, because I mean, now extrapolating on that point, people are going to come back and say, well, what about the road sweeper? What's it, you know? And we all need, you know, we need people to do all jobs, right? And does everyone doing kind of so-called menial functionary tasks have a dharma? Is that their dharma?
No, because there are so many misconceptions about dharma. One of them is that it has to be your work or your job, and that's just not true.
Right.
So I have a friend who works for the city on the crews that clean the streets and mow the lawns. That's not his dharma. His dharma is he's a wonderful organic gardener. He's in love with that. That's what he does with the rest of his time for him and his family. It doesn't have to be your job. My sister was a secretary all her life, and she raised her kid. Raising her kid was her dharma. She raised a kid, by the way.
Yeah. That's a good qualification to make, because I think increasingly we just see our work as our identity, you know?
Yeah, and it's not so.
Yeah.
And there's another one in there, which is that we only have one dharma in life. That's also not true. You can have more than one dharma at a time. And also, one thing I know is that dharmas can very often come to an end. So I just did a podcast with a guy in Alabama last week, and he was saying he's got this whole crew of 50-something men and women whose careers have petered out and they've dried up. And I said, yeah, because dharmas very often end. That's the call to reinvent yourself. So when a dharma ends, when a door closes, look for the open door, because there are always doors open. People get, the great Byron's The Prisoner of Chillon, where, the door is open and the prisoner won't go out. You've got to, I'm very interested in these between times when we're completely at sea about our dharma. So I have this experience, Adam, where I get what I call a Dharma assignment. That is, it gets clear to me what book I'm writing next. Okay. So when this book on the second book on the Gita came up, that's a Dharma assignment. That's what I'm going to do for the next 4 years. So I have 4 years of utter clarity about what I'm doing. And then it's over, I just finished this new book 2 weeks ago. And now I'm in this inner space of, we might call it liminal space, right? I'm done with the last thing, but I'm limin literally means threshold. So I'm between Dharma assignments, and it's very interesting. You really have to bear down on your practice in those times. You have to practice, as the Buddha said, like your hair was on fire. Listen. Listen for hunches, for intuitions. Notice where the doors in your life are opening. And it may be a surprise. I'll give you one of these. As I'm finishing this book, all of a sudden this door opened in my life that I never expected, which is that I accidentally became the co-owner of a puppy, right? Now,
I was expecting that. How accidentally, this is kind of equally as interesting.
I said to my best buddy, Brian, you've got to get a dog. He's divorced. He's lonely. Get a dog. I have a dog. So he got a dog, and the dog he got is fabulous. I fell in love with the dog. He's not so in love with her, so we're kind of co-raising her. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I talked about taking left turns. Out of the blue, I'm completely involved in the life of this 9-month-old dog. And I'm totally in love with her. I'm giving up all kinds of other stuff so I can take her to agility training classes. And I've hired a trainer to work with me to train her. And I love her to death. Boom.
So I suppose the question that immediately comes up with that idea then is, when we talk about Dharma, we're not necessarily talking about the kind of enlightenment kind of Dharma, right? Or are we?
Well,
I mean, Krishna wasn't necessarily kind of advising Arjuna he needs to get a puppy now, really. That's what he really needs,
But if the puppy does turn out to be your Dharma, then the puppy will transform you.
Right. So it could be anything. The material circumstances don't so much matter. Right.
The Dalai Lama calls his dogs Rinpoche, which means teachers. The Dalai Lama is devoted to his dogs. And I believe that if you devote yourself to an animal, if that's your calling, the relationship will transform you in some way, in some good way. And it does if you are to the common good, because the dog has a soul. Anyway, this is brand new for me, and I probably should.
No, it's really interesting. And just out of interest, what dogs the Dalai Lama got? Tibetan Mastiffs or something like that?
He's got big dogs.
They're Tibetan Mastiffs, probably. Yeah, they're huge dogs. Yeah. Right, where were we? Finally, then, how to become less attached to the ends, to the fruit of the action. I mean, I think you discussed discernment a little bit, which I think is very interesting. And the obvious question that comes to mind, how the hell do I know if I am doing my thing and it's just hard? It's just like, it is my Dharma and it's just hard. Yeah. Or I'm really just like not doing my thing, I mean, for example, I had a silly scenario when I first went to university and I was in the wrong philosophy department, and I felt, well, it's all, and I went to kind of psychotherapy, and the kind of message was, well, it's you, you just, it's just about your attitude towards things. And it's like, well, it's about what's inside you. And actually, I just changed it. I left the university, went to another one, and it was great. Night and day, so sometimes it is just literally like, it's not about, suffering through something, or it's just simply, you want to change that thing, So it's hard to know.
I'm sorry, Adam, did you go through a period of doubt when you were wrestling with that?
It was terrible because everything told me I should go, but this was something which was, I suppose, it was never expected in the, I suppose, my upbringing, that I would kind of go to university and not get on there. I don't know. It was a good one. The course was good. I never failed at anything before.
Yeah.
So to have this experience of that was, it was actually awful. It was a complete pivotal moment, I think, and it was huge. The crisis and the doubt involved in that was massive. Yeah,
I can only imagine. And doubt is a very good topic to dig into, because whenever the arising of doubt in your life, and the experience of doubt is the experience of being split between one and the other, right? That's the definition of doubt. 1 foot here and 1 foot here, and you can't move off it. But when a new Dharma is arising, almost always it comes on with a flavor of doubt, with an experience of doubt. And the contemplative traditions, doubt is one of the 5 hindrances in the traditions. It's grasping, aversion, sloth and torpor, restlessness, and doubt. Okay? So the instruction is always work with doubt in the same way that you work with the other hindrances. So with grasping and aversion, what do? You feel it, you investigate it, you don't deny it, you don't push it away. And it's the same with doubt. You open the box of doubt. Well, what's in there? Oh, here's a problem that I need to solve. Here's a question that I need more information on. So doubt is a very uncomfortable place to be. And you need to first acknowledge that you're in doubt, and then you need to work actively with it. Because a lot of people never recover from doubt. A lot of people put their folding chair down in the middle of an intersection and get up.
Right. Doubt is also really profound because it allows you to, it's fertile ground, isn't it? And it's open territory, and it's yoga, really. It's the unfamiliar, it's the unconditioned, and unknown. And my experience of going, you have these really fallow periods, and they can be quite dark. And doubt is, to doubt oneself and to doubt, oneself in context of other human beings is, it's a very, very difficult situation to find oneself in. But they've always born, the next phase has been incredibly fruitful on the back of that seemingly fallow period, which wasn't really. And I suppose, just to finally kind of go back to sharing that little story about the yoga teaching, and I found that before the lockdown, I was starting to find myself in a certain scenario whereby there were yoga centers all around me in London, and I could no longer almost be able to afford to continue to teach what I taught for many, many years, which was, anyways, whatever it was the yoga we teach, the Ashtanga yoga. And so I found myself in this really difficult period for maybe 2 years, and a number of other circumstances weren't great, and the living situation, blah, blah. And then suddenly this difficult situation, obviously horrendous with the pandemic, happened. But I found that online yoga teaching really, really works for me. And I never planned for it. And in fact, my wife told me you ought to do it. And I said, I'm not going to do that. It won't work online. It just won't work, And we had an argument, obviously, and then I listened to her because usually she's right, and I started it, and I've come into a new incarnation of myself after a couple of very dark years, really, in terms of the yoga teaching, and just in a situation one could never ever have imagined happening in a million years, and the secondly, it's such a small sidestep, really, I'm doing the same thing I ever did, but in just a slightly different way. And it works so well for me. And where the other thing wasn't really working anymore, I was doubting the adjustments. I was doubting where the Ashtanga yoga is big on the adjustments. And I was doubting, the worry about the intimacy now, the worry of the effectiveness of physical adjustments, as well as the situation with all these yoga centers surrounding everywhere and everyone going to different teachers and, the numbers dwindling because there's so many centers and, And suddenly something happened, and it was bizarre. Yeah.
The fact you very helpfully pointed to how fruitful a period of doubt can be. And I really want to underline that, because for me, I talked about Dharma assignments. When I'm between assignments, there's a tremendous amount of doubt and mystery and not knowing and mist, like fog, and I'm not sure where I am. And it's actually, if you use it properly, it's incredibly creative. You can learn to look for the open doors. Where's the open door? Well, you found an open door in teaching online. There it was. Boom, opened. You went through it, and that's what gave you the fruition you're having now.
I guess there's the opportunity, and then there's the ability or to recognize it and to take it, I suppose, right? Yeah.
And that requires flexibility and fluidity. And that's something that we know that yoga practice really promotes. And it's the capacity to be flexible and fluid. And when I look at all these great lives that I study, and again, I've just written a new book, and they all have this capacity to be flexible and to be fluid and to flow with the current of something new that's pulling them. Gandhi's the biggest example, but I talked about Robert Frost, right? Robert Frost's career was interesting because he had to go through many different phases of taking little leaps off the cliff. Because he was a poet. He knew he was a poet when he was 18. But poetry was not a vocation then. It was not in the earliest 20th century. It was not something his family would accept at all. And so he had to, in order to get to being a full-fledged poet, he had to do it in little leaps off the cliff, right? So a little leap where he taught school for a while, and then he bought a farm for a while, but the farm was really a secret way of poet, because he wasn't really farming. He was actually poetry.
Yeah, so, I like that. Right. I mean, finally, I think it's worth clarifying or hearing your thoughts on the idea that the Gita could be, people read it and they think, well, I just have to wait around now, like it can be read as a kind of determinist, fatalistic, kind of passive message, right? Like, you don't decide, right? Like, because you don't know, like you can't trust your own emotions, right? Like Arjuna can't really trust his rationale because he's shaking there in the battlefield, right? Like he's having this visceral, rather, intense experience, which clouds his judgment completely, right? So, I think that's meant to be clearly, kind of inserted there that, trusting our rational processes, which are influenced heavily by not only karma, but the physical experiences, the emotional body, which are circumstantial and, often fairly arbitrary, is a risky business to just trust our lucid thinking, certainly in the moment. So then we get into this kind of determinist rut where we just kind of do anything that's in front of us, right? Rather than be kind of grab the bull by its horns and actually, do stuff, right? And how do you approach that question?
I just totally lost track. Sorry, Bill.
Sorry, it's a preamble that was too long. So we have a fatalistic aspect of the Gita. The way it can be taken as a quite determinist tract, and what I'm suggesting is that if you read it carefully, it very much isn't like that at all. It's a very active, very engaged message that is being given.
Right. Well, the thing is, and what's very often overlooked in the Gita is Krishna does teach Arjuna one practice, just one practice. He teaches him meditation. And there's a reason for that. And that's, of course, chapter 6. And again, it happens pretty quickly. But, and we're given to think that this whole dialogue happens in one evening. It actually happens over eons, right? And he's supposed to be practicing something. What? Meditation. Why? Because meditation systematically deepens your attunement to your body and mind, to your subtle body, to all those koshas, to subtle mind, and that's the way to discernment. There is a technique. It's not just like one of the things that turned me off about Christianity, and I went through a Christian seminary before I became more interested in Buddhism, is that there's a lot of theology and a lot of rationality, but there's very little actual practice. What do you do? Well, there's a practice in the Gita. It's a meditation. But one also has to realize that practice is all in all meditation traditions, yoga, Buddhism, Jainism, in the Christian meditation tradition. It's always in the context of the scriptures or the great treatises. In any wisdom tradition has great wisdom treatises that will be helpful, like the Bhagavad-Gita or Patanjali Sutra. They have exemplars. That is to say, you might call them saints, or you might call them whatever they are. They're adept practitioners that you look to them to understand. To help you understand your life and your trajectory and your meaning. Very often they have revelation. So it's disputed whether the Bhagavad-Gita is a revealed scripture or whether it's revelation or tradition. So usually we're practicing within a given tradition and a great wisdom tradition that will have tons of resources for us to use, not only our intuition and what comes out of our prayer life and our meditation life, but the lives of the saints, the great texts, the treatises, the teachers, right? So in Buddhism, this is called the triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the community. So we use all of those resources, and because the Gita is in the form of a great dialogue, we kind of miss some of that. It's taken for granted because everybody reading the Gita back in the day was growing up in the context of a great tradition that had tons of resources. Gandhi said that he privileged what he called conscience, which is mind, subtle mind, the still small voice, the inner voice, awake mind, whatever you want to call it. Gandhi said, in difficult times, we must privilege enlightened mind, awake mind, right? And that's definitely cultivated through meditation and yoga practice. I don't know if that answered your question, but it was a long way around.
Well, it didn't exactly, but it was a very relevant point to make, that there was a definite practice there in this theorizing in the Bhagavad Gita, and as you said, it is the clarity of one-pointed thought, of sitting, and it is. There's no way around it to say that there is very specific. You find yourself some grass, some certain kusha grass, and you sit on it, right, and you're away from other people, like in isolation, not sleeping too much, not too little, eating too much, not too little, it's very specific, yeah. And I think that's often forgotten, that and I do think it's easy to kind of synthesize everything or give kind of easy whitewashing answers, but practice is there for a reason, and and it is, and in my life it has definitely borne fruit, and I think that a lot of the confusion I was talking to you about was only really started to be able to be born fruitfully when there was a stability of a practice underneath that. Otherwise, there was just a storm of confusion that I couldn't really use very, very helpfully. It was too much to bear. Yeah,
that point is so important, Adam. What you just said, the container that we're given when we buy into or enroll in or investigate one of these great traditions. It can be yoga. And there are many different traditions within yoga. Of course, there's the Raja Yoga tradition and the Hatha Yoga and the Tantra, and there are many different traditions. But I always advise people to find the one that really speaks to you and then go deep. It doesn't mean that you are eliminating anything else. Gandhi, again, I always go back to Gandhi, was very pluralistic in terms of what he used. But you do try to go deep into your tradition and find out what's there. What are the treatises and and who are the exemplars that you want to study?
Yeah, that's another good point there. Yeah, it's good to have some. It's a nice way to put it. Exemplars. Yeah. Not solely gurus anymore. We can call them exemplars. That's kind of nice. Well, I never find it easy to wrap up these things, but we've done an hour, so I'll say thank you very much, Stephen, for your time and for a wonderful conversation today. And I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I totally enjoyed it. It was completely fun from the beginning, and we had a little informal chat at the beginning, which was great.
Yeah.
I will visit you in France one of these days when I'm.
I'd love to have you. And I suppose people can find you on your websites, and the new books are, well, the new book I haven't fully read, which is coming out shortly. The previous book, The Great Work of Your Life, is a fantastic book. I've read that myself. And the new one is the Patanjali.
The new one is called The Dharma of Difficult Times.
Dharma of Difficult Times.
It'll be out in January. It's on Amazon right now. If you go to my Amazon page, it's there. But it'll be.
Having read a lot of other stuff that he's written, I'm sure it's not complete schlack. Don't worry. All right, Stephen. Thank you very much. And
my pleasure. Thank you, Adam.